A day in America usually begins with routines so familiar that people hardly notice them. The soft glow of morning light, the smell of coffee, the buzz of alarms, the quiet hum of traffic beginning to flow. Everything feels predictable, steady, safe. But if World War III were to begin, the first day would not start with explosions or chaos. It would start with a strange silence, a shift so subtle at first that most wouldn't recognize it. It would begin like any other morning, but with an undercurrent that something is wrong. Most Americans would wake up, reach for their phones, and find an unusual mix of notifications. Not dramatic headlines, but scattered reports from overnight. News of large-scale cyber attacks overseas, unexplained communication outages in certain regions, disruptions in banking systems in Europe or Asia. At first, these stories wouldn't feel like something that affects life in the United States. They would seem distant, the kind of international tension people typically scroll past. But as more headlines appear and more sources confirm problems, that distant feeling would begin to fade. People would notice government accounts posting updates much earlier than usual. News tickers would show phrases like global escalation, international emergency meeting, or unverified reports. Group chats would fill with questions and nervous comments. No one would be sure what's happening yet, but everyone would feel that something isn't normal. Parents would glance at their screens with worry. Workers would check the news while packing lunches. College students would exchange messages filled with confusion, asking each other if this is real or just another exaggerated rumor. As the minutes pass, digital systems would begin to show signs of strain. Apps would fail to load. Social media platforms might freeze under intense traffic. Some banking apps would temporarily restrict access due to high volume. Video calls might fail. GPS services could flicker. At first, people would assume it's just an outage, but then they would realize the problems are nationwide and global. This would be the first invisible sign that the world is shifting. Before any physical conflict begins, cyber warfare would be the first battlefield, and ordinary Americans would feel it instantly. Then, without warning, every major TV network, radio station, and government channel would announce a presidential address scheduled within minutes. This alone would send a chill through the country. Presidents do not call surprise addresses unless something extremely serious is happening. People at work would gather around screens. Families at home would mute everything else. Cafes and restaurants would fall silent as customers stop eating to listen. Schools might even pause classes as teachers sense the importance of the moment. When the president appears, the mood of the entire nation would change. Their voice would be calm but firm, deliberate but urgent. They would confirm what people feared, that multiple allied nations have come under attack, that cyber warfare has been launched on a global scale, and that the United States is activating defensive protocols. Words like protect, prepare, stand united, and maintain calm would fill the speech, but the sentence that would echo through every home would be simple and devastating. The world is entering a global conflict. World War III has begun. Shock would ripple across the nation. Some people would gasp, some would cry, some would sit frozen, unable to process what they just heard. Others would immediately try to call loved ones, even though phone lines would already be overloaded. The truth would settle slowly, like a heavy weight falling onto every heart. This isn't a movie. This isn't history class. This is real, happening now and happening to everyone. After the announcement, Americans would step outside and notice something unusual. Civilian air traffic would go quiet. Airport operations would halt instantly. The sky, normally filled with crisscrossing trails of airplanes, would be nearly empty except for military aircraft repositioning across strategic locations. The deep, distant rumble of jets moving in formation would replace the familiar sound of commercial airliners. Highways near military bases would fill with convoys transporting equipment. Rail lines would quietly shift into military logistics mode. Ports on both coasts would tighten security as naval deployments accelerate. For most Americans, this would be the first time they witnessed the nation's full military readiness truly activate. It would be surreal, both reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring because the country is prepared. terrifying because something enormous must be happening to require such preparation. As the day goes on, the emotional impact would begin to surface. Parents would rush to pick up children from schools, not necessarily because of any threat, but because instinct tells them to keep their family close. Grocery stores and gas stations would be overwhelmed. People would try to buy essentials, water, batteries, canned food, medicine. Not because shelves are already empty, but because fear spreads faster than supply chains. Store workers would struggle to keep order. Long lines would form at ATMs as people try to withdraw cash. Some would panic, some would remain calm, some would help others in need. At the same time, families would desperately try to contact relatives in other states or overseas. Phone networks would be congested. Messages might take minutes or hours to send. Social media would be unstable, yet people would keep trying, calling parents, grandparents, partners, siblings, children, just to hear their voices or make sure they are safe. Many would say things they haven't said in years. Crisis reminds people what matters most. Throughout the afternoon, news stations would operate non-stop, bringing updates as fast as possible. Analysts would discuss global alliances, cyber attacks, diplomatic negotiations, and military mobilizations. New terms would enter everyday conversations. People would realize the world has shifted into a dangerous, unpredictable phase. Fear would mix with confusion, and confusion would mix with hope that diplomacy might still stop the situation from escalating further. Neighborhoods across the country would grow quieter as people remain indoors. Streets would seem emptier than usual. Parks would be silent. Restaurants would close early. In some communities, local leaders, religious centers, and volunteers would gather to support others emotionally and practically. People would bring supplies to elderly neighbors. Parents would comfort children who don't fully understand what's happening. Strangers would show kindness because everyone is going through the same uncertainty. As evening approaches, the president would likely give a second, shorter address. This one would focus on instructions, how Americans can prepare, where to find accurate updates, what systems the government is activating, and how the nation plans to protect itself. The UE tone would be steady, reassuring but serious. The purpose would be to prevent panic and maintain order. Americans would listen closely, absorbing every word. When night falls, the emotional weight of the day would become overwhelming for many. People would sit with family members, watching the news in dimly lit living rooms. Children would ask difficult questions. Adults would struggle to answer. Many would pray, reflect, or simply hold their loved ones tightly. Even people who live alone would reach out to friends or family for comfort. The idea that life has changed forever would sink in slowly. Despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, something else would begin to grow. Resilience. Americans would start planning calmly, organizing supplies, checking emergency kits, creating communication strategies. Communities would talk online or in person to support each other. People would rediscover a strength they didn't know they had. The nation would not fall into chaos. It would tighten its unity. In the late evening, the skies would still be quiet, except for distant military presence. Emergency alerts might come occasionally, updating the public with verified information. The internet would remain slower than usual, and some services might still be restricted. But the country would be stable. There would be no attacks on American soil, no explosions, no dramatic scenes, just an atmosphere of preparedness and suspense. People would go to bed with heavy minds. Some would barely sleep. Others would lie awake waiting for updates, scrolling through what limited information is available. Some would leave televisions on all night. Many would think about their future, their loved ones, and the uncertainty of tomorrow. And yet, through all of it, one truth would become clearer than ever. The strength of America does not lie only in its military power. It lies in its people, their courage, their compassion, their ability to endure difficult times. A nation is not defined by moments of peace alone, but by how it responds when history takes a darker turn. A day in WW3 for ordinary Americans would not look like movies filled with instant destruction. It would look like confusion, connection, resilience, and preparation. It would look like a society holding its breath, hoping diplomacy prevails. It would look like families rediscovering love, communities rediscovering unity, and individuals discovering strength in the face of uncertainty. It would be a day no one ever wants to live through, but one that would prove something important. Even in the darkest moments, human beings search for hope. And even when the world trembles, ordinary Americans would rise with courage, patience, and an unbreakable belief in tomorrow.